All right, two items of good news right off the top. Recording here Thursday, May 29th, the tumbleweed portion of the football calendar. Number one, we're less than 100 days away from the season opener. Pats Raiders, September 7th, 1 o'clock kick, Gillette Stadium, the launch of the Mike Vrabel era. Drake Maye having his first actual shot at being a normal quarterback in a regular offense with a competent coaching staff and some semblance of an offensive line. Cheers to Drake. Number two, no advertisements today on the Pats Interference Podcast, brought to you by the stellar and spectacular CLNS Media Network. And with that good news of no advertisements, as much as we love our folks and friends at Prize Picks and Game Time, I'm going to ask that you do me a favor and subscribe to my YouTube channel @_Andrew Callahan, inching closer to 1,000 because I just still insist on not promoting it except for right here on the show. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, just drop a rating and review. We have not asked for these in a while. But I will tell you, whether they are 1 stars, 2 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars, we appreciate them all. And you know this because I'm about to read you one of our last reviews, which after some nice things about how we go behind the scenes and do access stuff here on the show, ends with Callahan could benefit from taking a breath. He runs out of steams when getting points out. If I didn't appreciate the constructive criticism, I probably wouldn't have shared it with the rest of you. Didn't know that review was there. So if you like what we're doing, give us a thumbs up, 5-star review, whatever you can. If you got a mixed answer or a mixed bag, drop it in there. We really, really appreciate the feedback. It helps us grow and build out and now. So with that said, a couple of notes here, and then we'll get to talk to Seth, whose new book, American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. We have a big, broad conversation about the position because Seth, basically everything he writes turns into gold, in my opinion, right? We all have better pieces than other things. But if you are a football fan who want to get smarter about quarterbacks, like, of course, Tom Brady, and Drake Maye, who is in the book, buy his book. It comes out early in September. The pre-order link for Amazon, though we prefer you go to your local shops here, is in the description of this episode, whether you're on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple. We talk broadly about quarterbacks for the first 10 to 15 minutes or so. If you must skip ahead, and this is how you know I'm a gracious host worthy of the 5-star review, go ahead to the Drake Maye stuff that's around like the 15 to 17-minute mark. We wrap on some Belichick stuff. I know not all of you are wild about the Jordan Hudson conversation, but Seth has been writing and been around Bill, frankly, longer than basically anyone. So if he's going to be on the show, I'm going to ask him what the hell is going on. Otherwise, I thought it was a great conversation with Seth, who sounds like he will be back as we get closer to the launch date of his book, which is also in early September. I think it's September 9th, which is a Tuesday. Somehow all of the books come out on Tuesdays. I don't know why. Anyway, that is most of today's show. The reason today's show is not all about what happened at the OTA practice on Wednesday is because I was not there due to a personal matter. So we will recap the last OTA practice, open to reporters, which is coming up on Monday. We will then have another episode later this week. So you're going to get a lot of traditional Pats Interference football conversation and topics and info and deep dives. For now, because I don't have those notes for you, which you can find recaps at the Herald or frankly, wherever you want to go. Drake Maye was 9 of 17. Defensive line got some good pressure. Kyle Williams had a cool catch. Javon Baker got reamed out. Boom, there's your recap. In the meantime, we do have to talk about Stefon Diggs, who was not at practice on Wednesday, and 2 days before that was on a boat somewhere with a bunch of women and some pink substance in a small little packet. And Twitter being Twitter, speculation ran rampant that it's pink cocaine or it's this drug or it might be this or that. This is the time where I tell you I don't know what it is, and it's okay for you to say I don't know what it is. What is safe to say is that this is not good. And while last week I described Drake Maye's 4-interception practice as something bad that cannot continue, and I really don't care about for all the typical OTA qualifiers, this is something bad that cannot continue, and that I do care about. Because in the event that we live in the universe where this Patriots season, like the last few before it, comes with a lot of expectations and hopes and all this different stuff that builds up in the offseason and then fizzles out, and someone, which turns out to be very often yours truly, writes why this broke down, why things did not go the way that they were, and I wouldn't be writing these pieces had everything just been normal. This is a moment to file away. When the star receiver who's ahead of schedule is creating the first distraction of the Mike Vrabel era, for now, that's all that it is, right? And Mike has admitted this. There is no eliminating distractions. There is only mitigating them, okay? So Vrabel, to his credit, and what you could see is a seasoned, not just public speaker, but head coach dealing with issues like these, says, we're aware of it. I've talked to him, and the content of those conversations are going to stay between us. This is not only out of the Belichick playbook, but this is out of any good PR playbook, which is to say, he certainly, I would assume, told Diggs what I just told you a minute ago. This cannot continue. And it is also a good time, though, in the meantime, to see what happens next, whether this is a crumbling and we look back and are like, oh, there it was in May and Stefon Diggs. We all had these high hopes, but turns out the guy on his fourth team in 6 years, whose first team once published a video with all of his teammates saying, the teammate I would least like to date my sister is Stefon Diggs. Yeah, there was something amiss. And maybe why, when he got his 3-year, $69 million contract, only $16.6 million of this was guaranteed. This was not a match made in heaven. We're not projecting here. I'm not predicting. What I'm saying is it's a good time to remember, amid all of the deserved hype in an offseason that I've said before, if you're giving it anything less than a B, you are being contrived, a contrarian, and a troll. Like, Stefon Diggs was not plan A for the Patriots. He was not plan B. He probably wasn't even plan C, and certainly wasn't in their plans at the combine. You can go back and read the story that Doug and I published and talking to a bunch of people around the league and within the team. And it's for those reasons. And for stuff like this, where Bills fans, people within the Buffalo organization will tell you, we just got kind of tired of it. So for now, it's nothing. It's another blip. It's another breeze that will be swept up by a stronger gust behind it when we get real football and real things that matter. But it's just something to file away, because you don't want this for someone that's new to the organization and a budding culture who's been empowered, even if it's only $16 million guaranteed, to go out and about and being filmed with whatever went on in that boat. It's not great. It's not shaking the ground. It's just, for now, something that when you talk about the Patriots, the first time in a while, people are going, that's not so good. And there's a reason that everything that came together with Diggs came the way that it did. All right, that's that. We will be back again next week. More football talk, OTA practice on Monday. We'll have an episode later in the week. The week after that, we will also have 2 episodes. So we're talking minicamp, which will run June 9th through the 11th. 3 practices, all that really matter. And I'll wrap up with a big mailbag episode. In the meantime, Seth Wickersham on Drake Maye, on the quarterback position, on his new book, some Belichick, Jordan Hudson stuff. And I will see you next week. Hitting pause on myself to tell you, if you haven't yet, you need to subscribe to my YouTube channel @_Andrew Callahan. We will find every single episode of the Pats Interference podcast, plus clips, plus old clips talking about things off the field, from how to get into sports journalism, old Patriot stories, things that were just not topical to that week, but will live forever on my YouTube page. And while you're also on YouTube, go to Patriots Press Pass, where you get me, you get Greg Bedard, Taylor Kyles, Mike Cadlick, Alex Barth, Brian Hines, all of these guys and plenty more. Go to Patriots Press Pass on YouTube and subscribe, where you'll find tons of great CLNS media content. Plus, if you're into the Celtics, big summer coming up. Celtics All Access on CLNS, NBA History Channel, Bruins Rinkside, tons of content. Go to YouTube, subscribe. And if you're only listening on Apple and Spotify, first of all, thank you. But leave us a 5-star rating and a review. Tell us what you think to help this show be better than it's ever been before. We got big plans coming up, but you will only see what we have if you subscribe to my channel @_Andrew Callahan, and Patriots Press Pass on YouTube and anywhere you're getting your podcasts, but especially Apple and Spotify. Okay, as promised, Seth Wickersham, New York Times bestselling author of It's Better to Be Feared, the definitive history of the Patriots dynasty, the as in the Ohio State University, and longtime ESPN senior writer, once known as author of all the books, but there is a new one coming, American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. We will get to the Drake Maye tidbits in a little bit. Are you, as I often find myself, writing much smaller things, much less reported things, looking at this book being like, I can't look at this anymore? Are you ready to be done with it? Where are you in the process of like trying to wash your hands or celebrate?
It's a little bit of a love-hate. You spend this long on things, and I spent much longer on this book than I did the Patriots book. And I think that there's a blessing to that. And then there's also like hey, I'm used to living with this thing for so long, and I'm not quite sure to see it go. I remember when our first child was born, the nurses help out so much in the hospital. And I just loved that, it was so nice that, the nurses were like there to tend to everything you needed. And I remember when we were leaving, I was like, no, don't go. I like having you guys around. This makes it a lot easier. And in its own little way, there's a little bit of a semblance the same with the book where, saying goodbye to it and knowing it's going to be out in the world is an interesting thing.
Yeah. Well, some of the reviews have started to trickle in, and before you get to your basic elevator pitch, I'm going to start with somebody else's words because you've written and said enough already. But these come from a friend of yours, as I understand it, Rick Tellender,
Hmm.
titan in the industry of sports writing, columnist of the Chicago Sun-Times, said of your book, it's not about a single quarterback. It's about all of them. It's about anybody who's ever played, aspired to play, or been obsessed with the quarterback position, about anybody who ever wanted to be king. Ellipses. It's truly about the American phenomenon of envying and exalting the guys who line up in the middle of the football offense, want to call the plays, take the snaps, hand the ball off, run it, or majestically, heroically pass it downfield in wondrous spirals to zigzagging receivers and thereby control everything. It's about how we worship these boys and men, and above all, what it takes to be a member of this unofficial royal family. And man, is it a tale. Can you do better than Rick as you introduce the book here than what he wrote there for just telling us a little bit about, I mean, a biography of a whole position in a sport that's over 100 years old has got to cover a lot of ground.
Yeah, and that was my goal. I was kind of glad that he got it. I was like, okay, I completed that pass. Because I never wanted to write a biography about one guy, because even the biggest ones from Namath or Namath Unitas, they weren't big enough for what I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell what it means to do this job at every level, from high school to college to the NFL. I wanted to know what it builds in you, what it strips away. I wanted to know, for the very best of the best, what it was like to live with it the rest of your life. And, if you built yourself a certain way to get through it, was it incongruent with the rest of, normal life and life outside of football? I wanted to know the history, not of the forward pass, but of the quarterback. Like, how did this thing become so celebrated? And some of the answers go back to 1885 and 1906 and the 1940s. And I just wanted to show it is both is in the most minute detail that I possibly could, and in the biggest, most grandest way I possibly could.
So you knew a lot about quarterbacks, writing about as many as they did. And folks in New England obviously will know all the Brady stories over the years, going back to, again, looking at the days of Gillette Stadium being built next door.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if he'll play in there one day as he's about to win
Hmm.
the Super Bowl. But where is the biggest gap between when you started reporting this book, I know all these things about quarterbacks, or I think I know, to when you look back and go, of all the things I learned, this took me the furthest?
I think that the things that interested me the most and what I found was that there's a couple of characteristics. Like, I think that you have to have an ego that constantly needs to be fed to be able to do this. And in that way, it's analogous to a politician or a rock star or a movie star. I think that just throwing the ball isn't quite enough. I think that, like, it's become so big in our culture that you have to have an ecosystem around you where you're kind of at the center of it. And that goes from your inner circle to the building, the football facility to a certain extent. I think that you also need to have some sort of place to store your anxiety. And, for some of these guys, it can be alcohol or women or Instagram.
All
Religion,
three.
I got into, religion was a really interesting thing for me. Avocados, as we know in New England. But, religion was a really interesting point for me because I wanted to, try to understand that and how it actually, the quarterbacks who devote themselves to Christianity, how it helps them in a really earnest way. Um, and then finally, to steal your phrase, I mean, one of the smartest pieces on Bill Belichick ever written was your story on all the throws.
Oh, yeah.
And, how he would throw that phrase out there, as your generic compliment to underwhelming quarterbacks. I think that the biggest thing is we don't know who can make all the throws, because especially coming out of college, um, the windows are just different. There's just no predictive element really out of college. It reminds me a little bit of like when the Milwaukee Brewers had a minor league team in Denver, and they had no idea what to do. It was the Denver Zephyrs, and they had no idea what to do with all those players because all the numbers were juiced and influenced by the altitude. It's a little bit similar. There's like performance and grade inflation in college football. And when you come to the NFL, can you make all the throws? Can you do it in September? Can you do it in December? Can you do it in January? Can you do it in the fourth quarter of a Super Bowl with someone like Bill Belichick scheming against you like Eli Manning did, and to a certain extent like Matt Ryan did, like Nick Foles did. So those are interesting things to me because they require a confidence and precision and ruthlessness that very few people really have.
So one of the biggest pieces, or I would say nuggets, aggregation to come out of the book so far is what you reported regarding Caleb Williams heading into last year's draft, which was like, and him and his family deciding Chicago is where quarterbacks go to die. I don't want to go there. There was an investigation. Could you circumvent the CBA, try to get yourself to Minnesota because it's not cold enough in Chicago, but also Kevin McConnell coaches there. Like what? You could either delve into that or something else. What was the biggest surprise in your reporting? When you've been around so much, like I feel like the NFL does not allow for much surprise in those who report on it. But what else was like a wow moment for you?
Well, yeah, that was interesting. I mean, obviously, what they were trying to do was similar to what Jack and John Elway did, and to a certain extent what Archie and Eli Manning did, which is, try to give the quarterback some agency over his future employer. And, it wasn't unprecedented, but it was tougher what they were trying to do. And so I tried to let those stories speak to each other a little bit to try to show, a truth with quarterbacks. And that's that, like, luck depends on, success depends on luck much more than anybody wants to admit. And, where you're picked and the fact that an NFL team owns your rights for up to 8 years really is a really tough thing. And that's a huge piece of luck. So, there was that. I think that one of the things that was, I think, most interesting to me was just delving into the youth circuit nowadays. And it's a dangerous place. It's a dangerous place. There's a lot of pressure, of attention, of their sharks circling, teenagers. And, we talk a lot about the quarterback dad and the image it evokes, but it serves a purpose. The quarterback dad serves a purpose because you need somebody. There's no path, through the youth quarterback circuit. It's very haphazard and political, and you need somebody who just looks out for your interests and isn't looking for anything else.
So that leads me to my next question about where the position is going next, because when you talk about the roots, and this goes for any sport, but the training now that you would find in, for example, like U10 basketball, they're going to play the game a lot differently than you would have seen 10 to 15 years ago, given the way the position has gone from a shooting standpoint and spacing and all those different things. Like quarterback, I assume, is the same way. And even for me, covering the Patriots since 2018, a guy who grew up watching Tom Brady, lived in New England, my archetype for, I think, the modern position needs now is very different than what I thought even 7 years ago. Your ability to create in the same way that, again, in basketball, those elite guards, 5 seconds left in the shot clock, pass rusher bearing down on you. What can you do to make something out of nothing? As you see a lot more mobile quarterbacks, Drake Maye being one of them, Jaden Daniels, even the phrase mobile quarterback has gotten like a little dusty over the last 10 years. Like that's just the quarterback now.
It has, yeah.
Where are we going next?
Well, I get into that. And I think that one of the most interesting things, I think, is that what makes it so glorified and celebrated in America is the degree of difficulty. And I think that it's getting easier. And, you're seeing it in the advent, the rise of flag football. You're seeing it in college football, and the fact that, Bailey Zappi, a guy who can barely hang on in a roster, as owns the college record for most touchdown passes in a season. And I do think that as, we become more geared towards passing, as flag football continues its rise, and it will, as quarterbacks continue to be more celebrated, and they will, and as rules continue to shift to make football a safer game, and it will, it's going to make that job easier. And I wonder, as it goes, it's not, the next book is not going to be called American Kings. There's going to be women. Benita Crouch is I write about her in the book. I mean, she's, the Tom Brady of flag football. And, I think that as it becomes bigger and as it becomes slightly easier, little bits, so, Troy Aikman talks a lot about this, and that's like, guys nowadays don't have to worry about the punishment like he did in 1989. will it matter? As more people are able to do it at a high level, how much will it matter? I think that's kind of an interesting thing to look at, over the next coming decades.
Do you think this will allow for then, to another podcast host you and I know, for a zag? Because I feel like, even to continue the basketball analogy, the homogeneity of the style of offenses that you see in the NBA, even the NFL, where like you don't have a Shanahan tree now that's just like half of the forest that we're looking at. Is there, and I don't know what the zag would be, because again, 20 years ago, it was Michael Vick running around. And now that's a guy that might be a top 5 quarterback in the league if properly taught and raised from the flag football levels all the way to where he would be in the NFL. Like, is there an opportunity there? If it's easier than ever, there's more access than ever, there's more training than ever, is there a different archetype of player or style or offense that you could see coming?
I don't know. I didn't write about this. I mean, I think that the evolution would be having 2 passers on the field and, the defense having to defend both of them. That's what I think. I don't know what that would look like exactly, but like my gut tells me that, if the pass is the most dangerous weapon in football, they'll figure out ways to, make stretch defenses even further.
Okay. I like that. I'd seen that floated around. I think Kevin Clark had put that out like
Yeah.
someday. Maybe Belichick wants to get there, and we'll get to Bill a little bit later, of just like the next evolution, even if it's just to say, I'm still so much smarter than all of you because I'm going to try this. But if you give it enough reps, right? Not unlike the tush push, like, yeah, Jalen Hurts is really strong, but if you have multiple players and you just rehearse the pitch or the lateral or whatever it might be over and over again, there's something to be tapped there.
Yeah, and I get into this in the book, but it's like, look at what Mike Leach did with quarterbacks who weren't highly recruited and the blessing of reps, like few plays and a ton of reps and being fearless. You know what I mean? He wanted to have an entire game where he didn't punt. I mean, it's going to take someone like that who's just going to say, I'm going to do this. And then it eventually, works its way up after a lot of naysayers and whatnot. But, I think that I could see something like that.
Mike Leach also, I think people inside football know, but saw the distribution of the football as more than 50-50 runner pass. He was like, I'm not pass happy. I'm just spreading the ball around in a way that's less predictable. If it's half going to the same running back or then splitting up the receivers, he saw everyone would get 20% of the ball basically, or 15 some odd percent to each of his skill position players. And that changed the way that I watched football when I first read that about Mike Leach about 10, 12 years ago, because I'm not thinking as much about plays as I am players, which is to ask you now, of all the reporting that you've done, how should we change the way that we consider and talk about quarterbacks now? Either something that we can let go of that's a misconception, this is not true more than ever, or this is something that's coming up that deserves more attention to understand the position as you've written about it.
I think the battle between the internal battle between the person you have to be, which is kind of, you have to be willing to believe somewhere deep inside of you that you're superior to everybody else. And I mean that superior in the locker room, superior among, the league or in college sports, whatever that is. I think that there's a part of you that has to kind of believe that like, we've got all these great players and we've got a great game plan coming, but, kind of Tom Brady talked about at one point, the quarterback is the magic and you have to believe that you're the magic. And, that's not an easy place to get to. And, once you're there, it's not an easy place to leave, especially out of football. And I think that's I think is one of the most interesting things. You'll see, and I have a lot of really kind of interesting examples of that. But it bleeds over into everything. And, years ago, I wrote this story on Andrew Luck and why he walked away from the NFL. And, that was a huge reason, is that like when he was injured, and he had that time away from football, he kind of was able to look at his life from the outside and look at these parts of his personality that he had never really acknowledged, which is, he knew himself very well as a quarterback and very poorly in every other way. And he began to see how incongruent the work of being a franchise quarterback was with being, an attentive husband, an attentive father, potentially a balanced human, all of these things, those were things that he recognized in himself, which I think were really interesting.
So just bragging about being the best in your own household at everything is not conducive to a healthy relationship with your partner or wife or kids.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you give us one example? Because I find the ego part, which is something you hit on right when we started here, and we've returned to already within 15 minutes, interesting. Where I think there's an understanding on the outside, like, yeah, of course, these guys standing in against defenses comprised half of humans trying to take your head off, and the other one's trying to prevent your pass from being completed. Have to believe before they let the ball go, everything is going to go their way. And yet, when that confidence, that arrogance, that ego is shown to us in a press conference or demonstrably on the field, there is an American reflex to be like, no, act like you've been there before. So,
Yeah.
The book, at least as Rick wrote about it, is both a reflection of how we worship these guys and the quarterbacks themselves. But like, what was there an example that struck you as ego is bigger than you initially thought when you were doing the reporting and it showed up along your journey?
Yeah, it's just essential. And and sort of faking it is one of those key parts. And but you have to have it. And it also it's a lonely position, and you have to create an ecosystem where like it that ego and that belief can be nurtured and watered, because it's very thin and very fragile. And there's just a lot of examples of what quarterbacks do to try to keep that alive. Steve Young, he's like a great philosopher about quarterbacks, and he would talk a lot about when he was trying to replace Joe Montana, and he's up at 3:00 in the morning in his car crying and just saying, I just want to get out of here forever and quit football and go to law school. And he goes to visit Bill Walsh, and Bill Walsh is like, you're being over accountable. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like, you think the one thing a quarterback has to do is be responsible for everybody on offense. That's one of the number one things with the job. And here Bill Walsh, one of the football Mount Rushmore geniuses, is telling him, all you do is take responsibility for everybody else. You need to get in people's faces and tell them to do their job and all this stuff. And it's like this, pardon my French, but the mind F of it is really something. And you see it now. Like, look at the Giants. And you probably know Brian Daboll. He knows quarterbacks. Think about that quarterback room. That's a really interesting quarterback room. They trade up to draft a rookie, and they pair him with Jameis Winston and Russell Wilson. Now that, contrast that with like some of these rooms where they bring in a veteran. You think about like the Chiefs when Mahomes was a rookie and Alex Smith is the starter, but he's saying like, I know my job is to help get you ready. Like, does that really exist in the Giants quarterback room? Like, to me, that stuff is kind of interesting because, again, when you're trying to create this fragile ecosystem, the quarterback room has to be one of those places where it lives. And like for the Giants, I would be highly suspicious and skeptical that for a young quarterback, it's going to live in that room with that group of personalities.
Well, first of all, we have to remember the greatest ego in that room is not one wearing a helmet. It's Sean Stellato banging on my door right now, tell Seth that Tommy DeVito is still in that room. They have 4 quarterbacks, okay? So
exactly.
It's an interesting point you bring up too, as we kind of slowly, glacially pivot now to Drake Maye, because I think when you talk about ego, and better than literally anyone, all the reporting about the Patriots and Belichick and Brady, is that a big part of that culture was, of course, to subvert your ego. And Bill's process in doing this, and he had a willing, never saw him as a partner, but might as well have been a partner in Brady who was willing to do that, sacrifice to the point he goes, why am I doing this anymore? This sucks. I'm not having any fun. And you fast forward again, this is over a generation, not just of football, but of life, 25 years. And at the end, Belichick is not talking to Mac Jones. He's telling him, look at Bailey Zappi doing such a great job in your absence. That was an ego that, as someone who went to private schools and was well off from the get-go and worked his ass off and worked hard, but was very fragile and then broken early in that season with his coach authoring some of that fracture. And so I'm curious about if you were in charge now, Seth, of setting up said ecosystem to facilitate and massage and garden and water this ego within a functioning team culture, as the Patriots are now going to try to do with May, where Vrabel is going to take a Belichickian style, but in a modern sense. How would you do it? What are your guidelines or your, guardrails, as it were, for trying to develop a quarterback like, say, Drake Maye?
Yeah, I think that like the first thing is that you bring in a guy that, you know, puts the least on you as possible, that like already kind of like would fit into that system rather than someone you have to put the guardrails around. And,
It's like
I
low
spend
maintenance,
time,
a low maintenance
yeah,
prospect.
I mean,
Okay.
or somebody philosophically aligned, you know what I mean? Like that, I think that's it. And I think that like when I look at May, I was interested in him in college because initially, there's always two. There's always like the number one guy that everyone thinks is going to be the first pick in the draft, and that was Caleb Williams. But then there's always like an RG3 to the Andrew Luck or whatever it might be, another guy who kind of pops up. Maybe I blame television for this. I don't quite know, but it looked like May before it became Jaden Daniels, but it looked like May, and so I spent time with May and I spent time with his family, and I think what fascinated me the most about Drake is that here he is, the youngest in an incredibly competitive and athletic family. I mean, you're talking about really high levels everywhere, from the mom to the dad, who was an NFL quarterback. He backed up Vinny Testaverde, his brothers. And, here comes Drake as kind of the cocky little kid. And he would talk so much shit to his older brothers that, at times, like his mom was like, "You're kind of on your own." I mean, he would taunt his brothers during their baseball games as a little kid. And so when he decided to enter the athletic arena and go to North Carolina, be a May at North Carolina, I think that to me said a lot, because what he was risking there wasn't the normal failure that almost any other player, including Caleb Williams. Look, if Caleb Williams didn't make it in college, few people would have really noticed. If he had decided football's not for me. But if Drake Maye hadn't, it would have been almost worse, because he would have had to go to Thanksgiving dinner and everyone in his family would have known. And the fact that he was able to carve out his own notoriety within that system, I think bodes well for being coached by someone like Mike Vrabel, like Coach Vrabel, and like the system, and Josh McDaniels especially, and what they want him to do.
What do you think Josh will want him to do? Because I mean, I could ask about May stories all day long and hear about him talking shit and this and that, and I think that's a perfect example of both nature and nurture, and a debate long put to bed. But now we're just finding the line in the middle. But clearly, Drake Maye was in an incubator for a quarterback and came out, was the number 3 overall pick. Now that he's out, like what do you think the best thing that Josh McDaniels could do for Drake Maye, as you know him, would be this season?
Well, I mean, and this is where I would be really optimistic if I were a Patriots fan, because for whatever reason, Josh, outside of being offensive coordinator for the New England Patriots, has a very limited shelf life anywhere else in the NFL. But he's particularly invaluable in this particular role in New England. And I think what he's going to do, he knows how to make the game simple and eliminate, thinking for his quarterbacks. And I think that like Charlie Weiss did this really well with Tom Brady early on, is that they're able to design simple plays that look complicated and stay one step ahead of defenses. Now, that's not an absolute, but that's generally it. And so if, with Josh McDaniels, I think that what you'll see is probably a lot of efficiency. Belichick talked about it with Brady, where something he did so well was just avoid negative plays. And I think that they'll look to him to do that most of all. But, defenses are going to have an entire season to study him. And, it's not going to surprise me if Jaden Daniels struggles for half the year, and if Caleb Williams struggles. I mean, it's a process. And I think that of all those guys entering their second year, it wouldn't surprise me if Drake ends up having the best season, because of who's calling plays and because he has so much success simplifying the game through a quarterback's eyes.
Give us one other Drake Maye tidbit or tease it that we can find in the book.
Man, I'm trying to think. He takes me inside his first fourth quarter comeback, and that was in college, the first one of his college career. And I think that's pretty cool, because that's, you have to do it. You know what I mean? You can't be a quarterback and not be able to do that. And he took me through it, and I really enjoyed learning about it.
What do you get then of your sense of his ability to be calm in those moments, and or how calm he is or where it comes from? Because I think obviously that defined Brady so early, and he repeated it so often that it never left him. It was a part of his legacy. But in the tiny sample we have so far of Drake Maye, your naysayers, we have a show to do here in Boston on the radio and TV would be like, oh, he had a turnover problem, to which I would say, okay, like 16-year-olds have a parking problem. If it's still an issue, speeding and parking at 19, then it's a problem.
Yeah.
But he never did have a comeback last year and win a game in the worst environment for a quarterback. So where does it come from, or what do you see about him in those moments?
Well, let me just answer with like a broad question that answers it, but not specifically. So Kevin O'Connell was one of the people I talked to, for the book, and obviously, like he was a 4-year starter at San Diego State. He backed up Brady for a year. NFL career disappeared fast, and he gets into coaching, becomes one of the best coaches, and learned from some of the best coaches. And obviously, Caleb Williams got around him and was like, this dude can talk quarterback. Like he really liked it. And when I talked to O'Connell, so much of how he coaches quarterbacks is autobiographical. Like, what is it that I couldn't do and didn't do when I was trying to get a job in the NFL that I can take and apply? And one of the things he did as a coach is he went back and watched so many of the famous game-winning drives in NFL history, from Joe Montana in Super Bowl 23, John Elway, Tom Brady's. And what he realized was that, like, these drives were incredibly mundane, and they were executing plays that they would execute the exact same way in spring ball. And we know that it's not that simple, of course, but they thought of it in that simple of a way. And when you go back and you watch those drives, I mean, go back and watch Joe Montana against the Bengals. I mean, he dinks and dunks his way down the field, and he hits that one pass to Rice that gets them, into position to score. And Brady did it so well. His first comeback against the Rams in the Super Bowl, same type of drive. And when O'Connell would try out for teams, he would try to have that one wow throw, that, John Elway throw, whatever it might be, where the coaches, say, we got to keep this kid. But what he wasn't doing was taking the easy pass, and that's what they wanted him to do. And so I think that, like, when you look at Drake coming into a situation where he's inevitably going to be put in the situation of having to win a game, and those known passing situations, I think that, like, the person he has calling plays for him kind of knows how to draw these up and knows how to put these things together, and knows how to just keep the mindset level. I think that that's just such an important thing, where it's not a preseason game, obviously, but on some level, the quarterback has to be able to ratchet his emotions down to the point where, that's how he looks at it in that moment.
I like that a lot. And it has me thinking of, stories of my own to study and follow here, because I think in addition to the ego piece we've hit on, 10 times now, but the physical skill set's never being better than for quarterbacks now. You are physically more powerful. Emotionally, you are never more empowered than the quarterbacks coming up now. And Drake is as talented as they come, reining in that ability or that ego, resisting the temptation, as Belichick picked on Peyton Manning for all of those early playoff years of, David Halberstam having the education of a coach. Like, we're going to show you cover 2, but really back out into cover 4. And you're going to have to dink and dunk your way entirely down the field. Will Drake be able to do that in the moments where, his instinct might kick in of, I can deliver this win on my own. I can go for that big throw or scramble or extend a play and try to force things, when really the best way to get down the field is in 7-yard increments, and then the one throw to Troy Brown over the middle in the Super Bowl, or down the sideline to Gronk over Eric Berry in the AFC Championship game. Because to your point, there's one moment you got to hit, but around that, like, there got to be a lot of singles to put guys on base.
Absolutely. And I mean, he's going to be coached that way. I mean, believe me, he's going to be coached to do it. And, you're right. I mean, I mean, Belichick was so crafty. I mean, man, he just knew how to use Peyton's creativity and kind of brilliance against him in a way. I mean, there was one game where he gave him the run up the middle. Like, he instructed the defense to, like, basically allow a tunnel up the middle of the field, knowing that someone as bright as Peyton would just get bored calling, runs up the middle, and then the moment that he veers from it, they fall into a trap.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny how that works. The Bills and the K Gun, and then Mike Martz, and then Peyton Manning. It's different versions of the same bait that I think you keep at least Bill throwing out there. All right, one more, because you've overstayed the time I told you I would keep you, and I appreciate everything you've done here, and we'll promote the book before we go. What's going on with Bill? I don't like talking about this topic because I've said, and people don't believe me, including the radio show that keeps asking, he's out of my life. I have my plate full, and it seems off because a guy who was so famous for controlling the message, right? If Bill started throwing up game plans and instead we're like, we're going to give you everything but up the middle, you'd be like, what's wrong with Bill? This is odd. When he has the PR blowups that you see in and around all of the Jordan Hudson business, I go, something's wrong here. That's not the same guy that I covered 2 years ago. But what do you see as someone who's been around and studied and written about Belichick much longer than I have?
Yeah, I mean, do we have to go there?
It's just 10, 15 seconds. You know how to dance around these if you really want, but I would love to just get a little.
I mean, man, when the University of North Carolina hired Bill and made him the highest paid public employee in the state, I think that the one thing they thought they were getting was a drama-free, buttoned-up football program. And it's been everything but that. I mean, I remember Bill, they were talking in Lombardi, we're talking about, being the 33rd NFL team. I mean, we already have a Browns. Like, we're good. We don't need another one. I kid only because I love. I mean, look, I think that her desire for attention, and I don't think that that's a knock on her. I'm not trying to be insulting. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious.
I think it's understated too. Desire for power and control and influence and a platform. So yeah.
I think that as big as their age gap is, the gap between her desire for notoriety and his might be bigger. And, I just don't think that – I think that this got out of hand so fast. Belichick's book, which I enjoyed and I wrote about, he has one line in there about, what it's like to see your private life in the newspapers. And, they are – they're like the Bradgelina of I mean, has an American coach ever in history like had a significant other who drew this much attention? I don't think so. And I think that his personality and the way that he's wired is kind of ill-suited for that. And we're not talking about their players. We're not talking about the ways that he's going to slap around Dabo Swinney's offense, which I'm really fascinated to see, given how prolific offenses are in college football and how the hash marks are different. And, I think that like they just need to survive until training camp. And then hopefully the rhythm of the season begins to take over. But, it's been a tough stretch for Bill since he opened the door for Brady to walk out, and Brady walked out. I mean, I think, he finished his career at New England. I think it was 3 losing seasons in 4 years. Yeah. His handpicked successor at quarterback didn't work out at all. And, Parcells always said, they can never take a championship away from you. And that's true, but it's like, it feels, even for the people who have, written stories that try to do the man justice, like I have. And, even my book is critical in times, but it really tries to do him justice and look at his greatness. It just feels like the narrative has shifted a little bit on his career. And, for someone who wanted to stay in the NFL and couldn't, and, opted for this, for a different type of football and different way to kind of end his coaching career, you kind of hope that like he's able to get this thing kind of reset. I don't know how that looks, but you kind of hope that he could.
Yeah, I agree with you, if not for the simple fact of how human memory works, that we often remember the things at the beginning and the end. And we could talk about the championships. I think it'll just take longer to, wash out some of this, whatever you want to call it. If it does end badly or they go 6-6 and Jordan Hudson is the face of his North Carolina tenure, it'll take longer to go back and be like, oh, but 18 and all the Super Bowls and everything, as crazy as that sounds. But to your point, it's been a number of years. And look, he is a football genius. And this is not to do the TMZ segment like it's sponsored here on the Pass Interference podcast. But look, the man is a Titan and an all-timer and the greatest coach of all time. And so it's just, the more curious it gets, I could not have you on and not ask what you think is going on, because you would know better than virtually anyone. So
I mean,
I'm with you.
there's an entire cottage industry that's essentially dedicated at this point to his relationship. I mean, that is something else. I mean, think about that. And also just think about, like, when Brady and Gisele Bündchen were first starting to date and all that attention went their way. And you think about, one of the things, there's a lot of impressive things about Tom Brady over the years, but one of the things with him is that his performance always outmeasured his notoriety, and his notoriety was significant. And I think that, like, as we look back on his career, I think that's one of the things that, within the context of American fame, and to a certain extent, my quarterback book is about American fame,
Mhm.
we have to really, like, look at it and say that was really impressive how he handled that, because you're seeing it now on, a completely different scale when it comes to Coach Belichick.
The cottage industry, I think, is Pablo Torre, who now has a new boat that says like VX podcasts, and that might continuing to add rewards for everything. But that'll be it for Bill. You can pre-order Seth's book, American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. The pre-order link is in this description, whether you are watching on YouTube, whether you're listening on Spotify, or whether you're listening on Apple. You can find it there. I cannot wait to get my hands on this and read it. Is there any other detail or pitch or tease you'd like to make before I say thank you and get you out of here?
Oh, you can just thank me. We'll connect again in August. Maybe we'll have some more to talk about.
That'd be awesome. Seth, thank you so much, man.
Thanks, man.